the network, the internet has certainly penetrated far beyond industry, far beyond academia, and now is basically in the hands, literally in the hands of a large percentage of the world through their cell systems, etc. That has brought the public into the international regime, basically. Everybody has an opinion, everybody can state an opinion. Politicians listen to the public, at least occasionally, and that creates some interesting dynamic problems. One of the problems that have always faced it is just how can one escalate or prevent the escalation of a cyber problem into a physical problem. And that's part of what we want to address today. It's the impact of people on some of these issues. I have two very interesting people. Izumi Aizu, who is Senior Research Fellow and Professor at Tama University in Tokyo, and Tobias Berger, who is Project Assistant Professor at the Cyber Civilization Research Center at Keio University. I'm going to start with Tobias and ask a question. How does assessing the public's reaction to COVID issues and crisis, what can we learn from that to prepare the public for larger problems that could arise in the future in cyber area? Tobias?
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me on the panel today and on part of this dialogue. Hello, everyone. I'm Tobias Berger. I'm working with Dave on exactly the project he mentioned before. I think what is interesting to mention here is that much of what we've seen today has been on the more technical side, the data sides. Professor Farber and I have been thinking and working for a while about the human element, and particularly the human perception towards cyber crisis management. Going back a little bit, what I think was interesting, and this is something that Professor Redway mentioned last year as well when he was visiting us at the CCRC, giving us the lecture, he spoke about the agreement in society, the Hobbesian and security agreement between the government and its citizens to protect citizens, right? And obviously this isn't like centuries old agreement, but one wonders how would that originate or work in the contemporary debate about cybersecurity. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to understand in our research at the center. It's like what we need to, I think what we should ensure is a better understanding of the public concern over cybersecurity. Like researching this a bit was interesting because when we were thinking about this, how serious, for example, the US and particularly Japan, where base takes this cyber threat, we came along the 2019 Pew survey, and both Japan and the US responded saying that at least the public in both countries said that cyber threats were the primary threat. Like the rest of the world, for example, thought about environmental threats. Some nations said terrorism, but only Japan and the US said cyber threats were the most important to them, at least to the public. Well, when we understand at least that the cyber threats are important, and they're a legitimate concern to both societies, we don't exactly know what kind of threats, and particularly we don't know how the public would react to such threats becoming a reality, right? And I think going back to Dave's original question, COVID plays a role. I mean, we can assume that as a result of COVID, maybe the most important threat is now pandemics and COVID itself. But at the same time, I think what COVID illustrated is that in times of crises, societies, let it be in Japan, the US, or anywhere else globally, they expect an added and like strong response of their government. And I think we could assume that such would be the case as well in the case of the cyber incident. So here, what we've been trying to research and understand is like, how would the public react towards cyber crises? Our focus was, as Professor Farber mentioned, on understanding if it could lead to possibly escalatory patterns of conflict. Could a cyber crisis spin out of control because the public demands a strong reaction or not from the government? We've been developing and conducting a number of initial surveys that actually surprisingly seem to indicate that much, or at least within Japan, as far as we understood, that the public seems not too interested on escalating and foremost on like assessing the damage of possible crises and fixing that first and foremost. And I think this is something we've seen as well with the COVID response, is that if the public responds demands from the government to have a strong response, this focus should be foremost on like fixing the immediate problem and making sure that doesn't always lead to escalations. Please follow up, Dave, if you have.
No, we'll switch to
Izumi.
Aizu.
Yes.
Izumi.
Okay.
The question I have, you can answer any question you want, but what are the opportunities for Japan to learn from the COVID reactions so far, the cyber COVID reactions of the population? And what makes Japan different than the US in their reactions?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Dave, not only for inviting me to this panel, but for all the participants. He was instrumental in the development of the internet to Asia, including Japan, I could say. But also I was surprised that you started interesting dialogue using the IP Asia on these occasions. I have the pleasure to interview him on a video, so I put it on YouTube. I will share with you later. Having said that, well, what is unique to the Japan's reaction to this COVID-19, and I think it is also true for the larger cyber crisis, or crisis even, by the Japanese. Usually we are, as you may know, too little and too slow. In the case of, for example, the COVID PCR testing, many were sort of criticizing us. We were not prepared, but we are also pretty slow. For the lockdown, we don't do that. We are voluntarily doing that slow, but perhaps the myth is, but why they are so effective? And to date, I cannot really answer, but I think, yes, with the background, please remember the geopolitics. Japan is very detached from the big continent. We are all, secured by the seawater. When it comes to cyber, do we have the seawater like that to insulate us, to keep our security and safety? Of course, the large answer is no, but are we sort of accustomed to that, dealing always with some noisy neighbors with on the ground borders that we haven't really experienced? So these are the sort of background element of the Japanese people or society as an amateur sociologist, but I'd like to emphasize that. By listening to some of the early speakers, starting from Nanaida Izumi or Nakamitsu-san, we respect her a lot, the need for multi-stakeholder, the engagement by the civil society, yes, it's been emphasized, it's important. I've been involved with so-called internet governance since the early days of the ICANN and try to represent or push civil society to the wishes and the stuff. But actually in Japan, as the civil society concept and multi-stakeholder practice is very little to exist, I must say. I may play a wasabi's role here to be a bit spicy to the very tasty sushi and sashimi, but I need to highlight that our social structure is fairly different from that of the West or that of the US. Of course, we need to somehow collaborate and coordinate together, but these are the elements often, existing behind. Finally, perhaps, having said that, out of this COVID, one thing was very interesting to observe from Japan. You may know that some of the local governments and governors play a very sort of positive or roles, not only the governor of Tokyo, but mayor of Chiba, for example, Mr. Kumagai, put all the postings every day on the Facebook and responded to all the questions by any citizens very well. And these are the areas that the local governments now are actually closer to the front line, meaning closer to the patients, hospitals, and citizens. And one example is that Tokyo government asked the Code for Japan, the Japanese civic tech engineers, tech guys, to develop and run the COVID-19 website in less than a week. And they did that because they had a background story since the March 11th big earthquake and tsunami. They started the websites and the other activities. And they learned a lot from that lesson of handling the crisis that citizens can and should work on. on the ground. But then with a lot of background works, not only Tokyo government, but some other local governments, these civic tech guys got trust, so much so that they were asked almost on the fly for the COVID-19 thing. And then later they were asked by the cabinet office to join the tracing app development. In view of the privacy, if you're the civil society folks who understand the citizens' values and their positions in the society, and then contribute to the technical development stuff, that might be a very interesting case. And these COVID-19 websites from Tokyo were widely shared now in Japan. All the 47 prefectures have a similar, because it's open code, open data, as Jun said, but also copied in Korea and in San Francisco. I listened that these guys started to use the same architecture, started from Tokyo and spreading globally. These are not well known yet, but I think it shows some kind of possible multi-stakeholder development and also some actual exercises to the future. Thank you.
Okay. There was a question on the chat, which I'll summarize and then ask Tobias maybe to address. And that's essentially wondering if we have a way to, let me back up. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has this measure calling minutes to midnight. I think you're familiar with that. Do we have a metric for looking at just how close we are to a cyber crisis and to stimulate people and to give them a feeling? I'll make one other comment if I can. I think the difference, as a person who's lived in Japan 2 years, but been coming here for 40 some odd years, Japan has a very much of a monoculture. The United States has almost the exact opposite. That there are an incredibly number of cultures that have to live together. And the difference in the way governments react to that is, I think, very interesting. I'm going to ask Tobias to, he volunteered to answer some of the questions. I also would like to ask him to elaborate just a little bit on a Asian extension of the notion of what does the public think.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'll try to have both questions in one. I think the first question was by James and the second question by Mike. I think the social engineering exploit is part of it. And I think it's a good indication of tying into the question of Mike as well. There's several levels of like cyber crises, right? I mean, we can have the social engineering maybe as a starting point because it affects more the individual level. And I assume that's where most people in society are worried about. But having, as Mike says, having a skill is something we've been using in our surveys as well. So basically what we did, we have something of an escalatory pattern in our survey, asking respondents from very simple scenarios to more sophisticated scenarios. And interestingly enough, even in the more sophisticated scenarios in which the damage was extensive beyond the individual domain, it seemed that the respondents basically responded in the same way. That quite surprised me, I have to say, because I expected that if, like as Mike said, if the incident becomes stronger or larger, and let's say the number goes up like category 5 or so, that the responses of the public would have been larger and larger, but they basically maintained the same. That's mostly it. Dave, do you have a follow-up? And sorry, about the East Asia one, apologies. So we started off initially focusing on Japan, but we have been extending our surveys now to Taiwan and South Korea, and most interestingly in China. And that's going to be conducted by the end of next month. But we try to get a better understanding how the societies in each of these nations would react to the same kind of cyber attacks. As Dave said, I think Japan is where we started. It's interesting because it has a monoculture. For example, understanding how in the Chinese domain, people and the public's perception towards cybersecurity and cyber threats would be highly interesting to see. And I assume once we have the surveys and once the papers are published, we'll be happy to share it with you, because I think particularly like a country like China would be interesting to see how it would influence government's decisions towards cyber crises, if they may occur or not.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to throw in one other thing since there are no standing questions. If you look at the chatter, the background noise on the network in the United States at least, you begin to see a serious disconnect between science and the public's perception. So for instance, I think it was 50% of the surveyed Americans said they wouldn't use a vaccine for COVID-19. The impression one gets is that they really don't believe science. They don't believe scientists or engineers, and as well as a marginal belief in government. And I think that raises a very interesting issue, which I think is the difference between the United States potentially and Japan. So I'm going to ask Izumi in particular, do you have a feeling for what the Japanese perception of the believability in science and scientists and specialists?
Okay. Well, in the mainstream or of the public perception, I think we still keep a relatively good trust to the scientists, hopefully to the engineers as well. Maybe if you read too much from the SNS, the Twitters and the Facebooks, then there are many more noises you can see against the scientists. But according to some of my friends' study or research on how these noisy voices are created, they don't really represent the mainstream or majority of the people's ideas, but they are the very noisy minorities usually, if politically left or right or, academically, radical or not. Then, but this COVID thing is showing a little bit interesting that many people became an instant kind of or instantaneous scientists. Like, and as Mike said, well, we don't have any measures how to measure the crisis level of the COVID. Only we do is say ratio to the population or death ratio to, or the reproductive transmission ratio. All these very familiar areas 5 months ago are now very much a popular topic. And so I'm not sure. The thing I feel a little bothering in Japan is that even amongst the scientists or experts, we don't have much tradition of working together. We usually are in the silos. And it's very hard to find a great, humanity people who understands the natural sciences or computer scientists who understand history, although you cannot play double or triple role per individual. But forum like this, that we can bring different expertises and also continuously working together. And that is we need for the crisis like this COVID. It's a societal-wide education to medicine. And then the technology can bridge these, like this technology. But I may stop here.
Okay. I have a question from Admiral Boyer, which is an interesting one to both panelists. Is the constant news of small, medium-scale cyber incidents desensitizing the public to the threat of a major cyber incident? Let me amplify that just a little bit. Many years ago now, I asked a bunch of actually former RAND people just what they thought was the dangers of cyber incidents. And their comment was that they feared that it would go down an escalatory role that would end up from being a cyber incident to being a physical incident, namely physical interactions between nation states. But let me address Admiral Boyer's comment. Tobias, you want to make a crack at it?
Sure, I'll try to crack it. Thank you for the question, Admiral Brett. I think one of the issues we found out with the surveys is that for many people, it's hard to visualize cyber threats, right? I mean, obviously the small incidents come into the news, but I think for a lot of people having a larger scale incident in which the impact of the cyber incident is not only in the cyber domain, but possibly in the physical domain, as for example, when the WannaCry hit the US, sorry, not US, UK hospitals, I think that's easier to imagine. And I felt like when we spoke to people in developing the survey, it's often that the small and medium things kind of raised a little bit of awareness, but it was something that came in very fast and left their like perception very equally fast as well. So I think there's a big disconnect between the small and medium cyber incidents and the major ones that have not happened yet, if they will happen.
I'll put my 2 cents in for what it's worth. One of the problems we've had, of course, is that we've created a very extensive, incredibly valuable environment in the internet. And we built it on top of not necessarily the best designs for security and identification and all the things that you need in order to assure that the information you get is accurate. And I think one of the things we're going to have to face in the future is how to deal with the misinformation. I'm not going to call it fake information. It's more complicated than that. It's misinformation, slanted information. And how do we make reliable information more apparent than the noise, the incredible, valuable but incredible noise that exists currently on things like Facebook and Twitter. I think we're, unless there are other questions, I'm going to actually make this thing end completely on time because we have 2 remarks at the end. Right, Craig? Want to take over?
Okay, I think, yep. Well, we're going to turn it quickly back to you, Dave. Yeah, we're at the last phase of this, which is quick closing remarks. I guess I'll go first, Dave. You can do the complete closure on this.
Okay.
I would, just like to thank all the speakers and, participants in general. It was a very active session. I think we've all gotten used to Zoom for 2.5 hours. It's quite a long time. So thanks for the dialogue tonight. But I guess my main remark is, to go back to my opening, this is really in some ways the start of a process that we've teamed up with Keio on and, have now the Japan Society sponsorship and engagement with, in creating an ongoing dialogue between, the set of business, policy, and academic leaders and thinkers that we hope will sustain itself. My observation, having worked these issues for a while from both government and private sector perspective, is conferences are useful and networks get built, but we're trying to do something sort of the next level of that, which is to actually keep the same community engaged on a set of key issues, the 4 we've identified tonight, on an ongoing basis. So while the format we knew would not necessarily permit as much interaction or to get everybody's voice heard, we will capture the questions as we go forward and form into working groups in the dialogue. And I do believe that the people that participated tonight are building a community that we want to sustain for an extended period of time. Because I think essentially we believe that the US and Japan understanding each other and collaborating on these issues is a very important and beneficial thing to us all. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you for the concluding remark.
I would say ditto for many of your remarks. We at CCRC are committed to continue this collaboration with Columbia and Japan Society. It's an extremely important area. Each of the 4 areas can elaborate into a much more in-depth study. And I think Japan and the United States have much to learn from each other, as they've been able to learn from each other for many, many years. We're 2 great civilizations separated by not a common language, to paraphrase Churchill, but we seem to be able to communicate. And I'd like to see us continue to communicate. CCRC is dedicated to that purpose, to seeing and helping the future of cyber civilization. Thank you very much, Greg. And the audience, thank you.
And with that, we conclude the session for tonight. Thank you very much.